Spider-Man and Batman are two very different characters in terms of wealth and education, but in a lot of ways they're actually very similar characters. Both of them are orphans, they both have genius-level intellects, they're heroes who fight for the underdog and don't kill, and even their fighting style is quite similar. Spider-Man has powers, yes, but they are both still hand-to-hand brawlers who use gadgets, and they like to crawl around on rooftops using webs or grapples to get around. And with the introduction of gliding in the second Spider-Man game, well, it's easy to see that Insomniac got a lot of inspiration from the Batman Arkham game series, as there are just so many similarities to the gameplay that are so obvious that I won't even waste much time on them, because anyone who's played both the games will know exactly what I mean. Now, I'm not complaining about this, I actually consider it to be fair play. After all, it's no different than first-person shooter games being similar. There's just a right way to do certain things, and this is the right way to do it for superhero games. But as I was playing the first Spider-Man game the other day, I started to notice how similar the boss fights are to the Arkham games, like crazy similar in places. Such as the final Martin Lee boss fight in the first game, where we fight the head of the Demon Gang as he attacks us with a sword and brings a giant-sized monster to life in a sort of semi-hallucination, along with a faceless army of lesser fighters in order to distract us. And in Arkham City, we fight the head of the demon who attacks with a sword and brings forth a giant monster to fight us, along with an army of faceless lesser warriors to distract us. So you can see what I mean about them being similar. Heck, even when you punch them, they flicker between normal and superpowered. So this video is just going to take a quick look at some of the boss fights from the Arkham series and the Insomniac Spider-Man games and compare the similarities. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments. Scorpion and Copperhead. Now, these characters are both very different in appearance and in skill level, but they're very similar in the fact that they are both criminals for hire who fight hand to hand and like to use poison on their enemies. And in the Arkham Origins game, Batman is poisoned by Copperhead and has to desperately scramble to go get the cure. And the poison causes him to hallucinate, so he actually sees several Copperheads, and he has no idea which of them, if any of them, is actually the real one. And the same thing happens to Spider-Man when the Scorpion poisons him. He scrambles to get a cure but is vividly hallucinating. Although to be fair, the scale of his hallucination is much bigger. It's important to remember that the Arkham games were made for older generations of gaming consoles, so they were restricted by the hardware of the time, and they couldn't make the games as elaborate as the new Spider-Man games can. But still, in Spider-Man's hallucinations, he fights several Scorpions, with no idea which, if any of them, are actually the real one. And they even attack in the same way, keeping their distance for the most part and then speeding in with deadly strikes. Although admittedly they do throw poison, which is a little bit different. But it's not just the fight, even the dialogue structure is the same. The poison is causing Batman's mind to taunt him with his failings, and his father figure, Alfred, lectures him on how his superhero ways are a waste of time and that he is a disappointment to the Wayne legacy. And Spider-Man has the same thing happen, with his current father figure role model, Otto Octavius, coming forth in the hallucination to lecture him on his failings and what a disappointment he is. Of course, they both get the cure and it's fine, and they go on to defeat the bad guy, but it's interesting how similar both their enemies are and how they respond in the same way to the poison, with their minds hallucinating and then questioning their actions using father figures to point out their failings. So they're very similar, although to be fair, this does actually say a lot about their mindsets. As I said in the beginning, they have a very similar hero mindset, so this could be the reason. Sandman and Clayface. Another elaborate Spider-Man fight is in Spider-Man 2, right at the very beginning of the game when they go up against Sandman in what is an insanely over-the-top and literally larger-than-life boss fight. And it is a lot of fun, and it's also a great way to start the game. But the Clayface boss fight in Arkham City is very similar in some key ways. True, the Sandman one is on a much grander scale, but both of these fights see the hero versus a shapeshifter who is beige coloured and in a sort of human-shaped form. And because they're not made of flesh, they are immune to most standard attacks. Clayface can't really be hurt in the normal way, so Batman has to use the elements and freeze his opponents. Spider-Man of course has the same problem with Sandman, and he uses the elements to take him down as well, both water and lightning. And when the bad guys start to struggle in the fight, they use their powers to shapeshift into a faceless beige army to take down the hero. Both Sandman and Clayface do exactly the same with their tactics and powers, trying to crush them with their larger size, and when it's too tricky, turning into a small army. I mean, there are some serious similarities between these two. Bane and Kraven. Now, it's not just the fights with these two that are similar, it's also the personalities. You see, both are mercenary leaders who control a cult-like army of macho muscleheads, both have super strength thanks to their steroid abuse, and both of them want the hero to kill them. Admittedly, in Bane's fight, he's also happy to kill Batman and carry on, but he is also trying to get him to kill him.
I won't kill him.
But you will. You will fight me with all your resolve, or you will die. Someone is going to die. You, me, or the clown. The question of which one of us it is in your hands.
He wants him to do this so that he can go against his philosophy of not killing after all. But in Kraven's case, he does just want to die, so a bit different there. But there are still some very good similarities, especially since this version of Kraven is so very different to the one in the comic books. Now, admittedly we're talking about Bane from Arkham Origins, so it's a bit different as well, but his similarities to Kraven are just insanely alike. I mean, it's like they've changed it to match him in a way. And I must say, I do actually really like this version. In some respects, I actually prefer it to the comic book. But it does seem very likely that he was inspired, at least in part, by Bane from Arkham Origins. And while their boss fights have some key differences, they also have some key similarities. Thanks to their steroid abuse, they're very strong and fast, and they basically rush at you with super speed and then use their super strength to crush you, while also calling allies to distract and hurt you while they continue to attack. Though admittedly Kraven does use more gadgets, whereas Bane is so powerful he doesn't really have any need for them. And Kraven's allies are also way better. I mean, I love these giant metal animals. Don't know if they're wolves, cheetahs, or some other cat or whatever, but these animal hunters are just amazing. And I seriously would love for some millionaire to make them in real life. It would just be so cool to actually see them working. Now, these similarities could be coincidence, but considering there's so many overlaps not just with this but with other characters, it does seem likely that Arkham Origins had some influence, at least over the creative direction that Insomniac took Raven's character. Joker and Hammerhead. Now this one's a bit odd because they are actually very, very different characters, and yet there is some serious overlap with them. They're both in charge of criminal empires, and while Joker wants to use Venom to create a powerful army, Hammerhead wants to use technology to do the same. So they do actually have very similar goals, and their final boss fights are also pretty much the same. Joker uses Venom to turn himself into a giant so he can fight Batman hand to hand, and of course he calls in thugs to distract and hurt Batman. And Hammerhead does exactly the same, except he uses technology. But he uses tech to turn himself into a super strong giant, and then calls in his thugs to distract and hurt Spider-Man. And both of these transformations are incredibly extreme. I mean, these are some serious deformities. So, although it may not look like they're the same on the surface, when you actually think about it, you can see a lot of similarity. I mean, their plans are quite obvious things to do in the superhero world. I mean, giving your crew superpowers, and yourself as well, does make sense. And of course, each of their goals differs. Hammerhead wants power and respect, and to control the New York crime racket as the new Godfather. Whereas Joker is just more interested in causing chaos for the sake of causing chaos. But ultimately, their plan is carried out in the same way. And the fact that Hammerhead cuts off all his limbs to transform himself into a super strong giant, well, it does have a lot in common with the Arkham Asylum final boss, and it's also very weird. I mean, both the Joker and the Hammerhead seem out of character when they're doing this. It's not really how I would think of them from the comics. Although I must say Hammerhead transformation is so much more drastic. I mean, he removes all of his limbs and replaces them with metal ones. That's just mental. And while the Joker becoming a deformed Hulk is also pretty crazy, well, at least Joker is full-on mental. But whether it makes sense or not, it is what happens in the game, and I think the fights are just too similar to ignore. Rhino and Bane. Now, in the Rhino fight, you wait for him to charge at you, and then you hit him with something in the environment to stun him, and then you get a chance to punch him out. And when you fight Bane, and venomed up Bane-like villains in Arkham Asylum, you wait for them to charge you, then you throw them with batarangs, so they hit the environment and are stunned, and you can punch them out. Now, this is actually quite a similar trope in older Spider-Man games, to be fair, and it is quite common across the comics, TV shows and such where he does this. So it's quite possible that it's not inspired at all by the Arkham games. Though of course these older games did have different developers, so Insomniac may have just carried it over from previous games, but considering they've got other inspiration from the Arkham games, well, it could have gone either way with this. Although it does have to be said that Miles Morales riding the Rhino in the next game is very similar to when Batman rides the Venomed Out villains. He's using their charging to their advantage, and though Morales does defeat him in a very, very different way thanks to his Venom powers, well, there is a similarity there.
I will break you, Batman! Then the Bruja!
No, Bane. This time I break you!
Mysterio and Scarecrow. Now, these villains are very different, but both of them use technology to make fantasy worlds appear real, though they do it in very different ways. Scarecrow, of course, uses chemicals to make crazy hallucinations, and Mysterio uses technology to make the mind think that anything he can imagine is real. And the gameplay is very different on their boss fights, but you have to admit, them transporting the hero to a crazy world, and both of them appearing like gods or giants, is very similar. Scarecrow even summons an army of skeletons from the ground, just as Mysterio summons an army of warriors from the grave. So it's very similar in that sense. And there's also Taskmaster and Deathstroke being very similar. But in fairness, I don't think this is inspired by Arkham really in any way, to be honest. I think it's just they're very similar in their styles. There are some characters that are like this, which is why I mention it. I mean, we can try and find similarities with a lot of it, but some of it is just going to be coincidental because they are both superhero games. But these fights are far from the only similarities, so we all know that the game was clearly heavily inspired by the Arkham series. And I have no doubt that the developers are huge fans of that series, but the point I'm making is there is obviously some inspiration. The fighting style is almost identical, as are the Predator missions very similar. They have the secret takedowns and the knockouts and the sneaking around. And again, I'm not complaining, quite the opposite. I love this style of gameplay, and I seriously wish that more developers would adopt it. But still, I thought it was kind of interesting just how similar some of them are, so I thought I'd get a discussion going on it. And I also wanted to say that I wish Insomniac would double down on this and take even more from the Arkham games, as the first Spider-Man game boss fights have a lot in common, but the next games not as much. In fact, some of them are a little bit bland if I'm being honest. Still a lot of fun to play, but in Spider-Man 2 the boss fights do get very samey as the game goes on. It's just fights with a stronger character that you attack in the standard way. There's not really any tricks to the boss, like attacking at certain points or using special attacks here and there to stun them. Yeah, there's some of it, especially with the symbiotes, but really you may just keep attacking in any way you want until the bad guy's health meter runs down. And then when it does, you have a little cutscene and you usually do it again. I mean, there's still a lot of fun to play, but I just feel they lack the charm of the first game's boss fights. They're just not as quirky, you know? In fact, that's my only real complaint about the second Spider-Man game, as I thought everything else was bang on point. Even these boss fights aren't that bad, so it's not really that bad a complaint. I'm just saying I think they could do better and make it a little bit quirky. But what do you think? Do you agree that these boss levels are extremely similar and are clearly inspired by the Arkham bosses? And what do you think of the second game's bosses compared to the first game's? Let us know in the comments, along with which one of these is your favourite of course, and if there are any other similarities that you've noticed between these games. And again, let's not try to compare the two or say one's better or anything like that. They clearly took some inspiration from it, and that's fine. That's just how games are made. It's no different than a first-person shooter being the same, an adventure game, anything. These tropes just work. We're just discussing how they're similar, purely for a bit of fun. And I'd just like to quickly remind everyone that we have some merchandise available on our store, and to say thanks to all of you who have donated to the Needle Mouse Productions page on Patreon. And as always, thanks for watching, and feel free to subscribe, share, like, and comment.